Hi, today we're talking with Ryan Holiday. He has a lot of things going on in his life, a lot of writing, a lot of books, a company called Brasscheck, and he's one of the very few people on earth that knows and appreciates that there is a book called The Brass Check, and it was written by Upton Sinclair. It sold over 300,000 copies, which is a lot of copies for 100 years ago, and it's even a lot of copies for today. He had to self-publish it. He considered it on par with his famous book, The Jungle. So The Jungle being a fictionalized account of life, and the Brass Check being an account of his own life and his own interactions with the news media as it existed. 1919 is when the book came out, so that makes 2019 the 100th anniversary of this book. I reached out to Ryan and said, Ryan, you know this book, you appreciate this book, let's talk about it. So for people that don't know what that book did and what it accomplished, it inspired somebody very important who wrote a book called The Lords of the Press, and that's George Seldes. And George Seldes is another name that people don't know, but you're going to know these names. Daniel Ellsberg, Howard Zinn, Ralph Nader, all three of these individuals attribute their interest in what they do today, or what they did, because Howard's dead, of course, has passed away, to George Seldes. And George Seldes attributed his interest and his orientation in life to the Brass Check. So Ryan, how did you discover the Brass Check? How did you even find it? Because it's an unfairly obscure book.
Yeah, it is a very unfairly obscure book, and it is interesting. You read The Jungle in school, which is a sort of an expose of the food industry, which obviously affects everyone, but largely the abuses that Upton Sinclair is sort of documenting in that book no longer exist because we had all sorts of legislation, primarily because of the book, that addressed some of those more egregious problems. And then to know that Upton Sinclair would go on and write his next book, or shortly thereafter, an expose of media, and almost all of the problems that he highlights in the book remain unaddressed, to me as this sort of grave injustice of our educational system. I don't remember exactly how I found out about the book. I was the early parts of my career were in marketing. I worked for a number of really controversial clients, and I kept sort of seeing a bunch of problems with the media system. And I thought, well, let's go back. Let's sort of trace these problems back, and let's see what's really happening. And I probably read a book of media criticism, and then that recommended an older book of media criticism. And it took me back, 100 years until I'm sitting there holding Upton Sinclair's book, and basically everything he's saying in this book, you could just swap out the word newspaper and put blogs and social media and mention television, and you could have published that book. I must have read it in 2010, 2011, but you could have published that book then, you could publish it today, and with only a few changes, it would sound as if he is perfectly describing the media environment that we're in now. And I think this is important for people to understand, not just people who are critics of the media and viewers of the media, but people who are public figures, who are brands, who are trying to put messages out in the world. You've got to understand how this system works.
I thought one of the interesting things about the book was how detailed he was in a way that I don't see contemporary media critics being. In other words, he would describe not just the news outlet that he took objection to, but also the owners or the industrial influences in a really precise way. And you just don't see that today. You'll hear people complain about the media in general, or you'll have partisans complain about Fox, and then other people complain about CNN, who are on the other side. But no one ever says, well, this is the guy or this is the group of guys that own this particular outlet. This is their point of view, and this is what they're allowing out, and this is what they're not allowing out. So I think
and look, I actually think that theory is a little overblown. The idea of, I think Chomsky advances this too, the idea that there are these sort of super rich people who are owning the news and therefore directly controlling it. I think what I think Sinclair perfectly captures in the book, and I think is still true today, is the way the sort of individual incentives are acting on the individual actors in the system. So the way that a reporter who is forced to churn out too much content ends up not caring about facts, right? The way that when one outlet draws from another outlet, which is drawing from another outlet, which is drawing from another outlet, you get this game of telephone where the facts become sort of warped and twisted. And I think that's one of the most compelling parts of the book, where Upton would take sort of a story or something that happened to him, like where he was written about, this one obscure newspaper in this town would write this thing, which would get picked up by the wire service, which would get repeated and then repeated. And that's actually something I ended up talking about in my book, Trust Me, I'm Lying, which is the way that even though so many things have changed, a single tweet from an unknown person can turn into a major news story, and how we got from there to here can be very obscured as far as the public is concerned. And so I think what Sinclair is really capturing, and what he did an amazing job of, is sort of explaining how public opinion is being warped and influenced by the economics of the news business, just in the way that the economics of the food industry were changing, what we were putting in our mouths.
Gotcha. And yeah, in the book that you mentioned, I recommend highly to everybody. It's sort of I read it, as I was reading it, I was thinking of the Brasscheck, and then lo and behold, I discovered that you knew the Brasscheck when I actually got through the book. Trust me,
it was probably the biggest source for me writing that book. I mean, I remember there's one thing Upton Sinclair talks about that, like one of the things I'd found, sort of working for clients that tended to get written about a lot on the internet is, people would write things that were totally inaccurate, and then they'd be like, oh, well, we'll correct it, right? And the ease with which things are able to be corrected in the online era is used as sort of a rationalization for the speed to which news goes to market. And I remember there's this was probably one of the first times when it struck me of the similarities. There's a passage in the Brasscheck where, Upton talks about, he's like, look, this is like sending out an army of laborers into the desert to dig holes, and justifying it with the fact that they can easily fill those holes back in. And so he just has all these sort of potent observations that sort of just dismantle a lot of the bad assumptions that were true in the media then, that maybe got addressed a little bit in the middle of the 20th century, but we've somehow reverted back to. And so when we wonder why things are the way that they are, and why, the world is sort of so divided, and why it's so hard to agree on reality, I think you could do a lot worse than picking up the Brasscheck if you're trying to understand how or why.
Great. Yeah, in a way, we've sort of reverted back to the what they originally called yellow journalism, the newspaper wars, where each there were multiple newspapers in a city because there was no television, there was no radio, so newspapers were the only game in town, and so there was a lot of business and a lot of competition, and they competed kind of using clickbait, what we now today would call clickbait.
No, that's totally right. I probably got that from Sinclair as well. Like the idea of these sort of newsboys on the street corner shouting to be heard over each other. He talks about that very, very eloquently in the book, and just sort of describing the way that what the newsboys needed to sell papers was acting upon what the editors were having their writers produce. And I think, you could argue Google News is just the biggest street corner in the world, and it's got hundreds of thousands of news outlets, and that's what Twitter is as well. So you have these people that, instead of there being 200 newspapers in New York City or 20 newspapers in New York City, and the competition between them, sort of subtly and not so subtly influencing the news, what we now have is like 2 billion, blogs and media outlets and social media accounts, Now, everyone is a news outlet, and we're all exerting that same force, so it shouldn't surprise us that, things are more extreme and seem to be moving faster than ever. That's, great for business.
And as you point out in your book, Trust Me, I'm Lying, this system can be manipulated by people that understand how it works.
Yeah, sadly. I mean, I think Trump, as sort of an intuitive understander of the economics of reality television, has sort of figured out exactly, it's interesting. I think people think that media manipulation is like what the CIA does, right? It's like this sort of covert propaganda thing. I think it's much more widespread than that, and it's much more about playing to what the system wants or needs. So, it should give you some insights if you're like, who does the media hate more than anyone? Probably Trump. And yet, how is Trump able to make them do so often exactly what he wants? It's because at the core of it, for all their disagreements, they're speaking the same language, and they are riding the same sort of tiger, so to speak. And this insatiable need for content ultimately makes them very aligned, even if their political views are very unaligned.
It's a collaboration, and even back in the 70s, Trump was a master media manipulator.
Yeah, no, he totally was, and I think people go, oh, what is the Brasscheck? What does that mean? I think they don't understand, the metaphor that Upton Sinclair is making is a pretty dark one. His point is that the Brasscheck is the token you get or the credit you get when you walk into a whorehouse. And his point is that journalists are whores, basically, for all their sort of, high-minded rhetoric and their, sort of positioning as the, the fourth estate. I think it was Les Moonves who said during the 2016 election, Trump might be bad for America, but he's really good for CBS. I mean, I think that he is capturing the exact thing that Upton Sinclair is criticizing in the Brasscheck. These people claim to believe X, Y, and Z, but at the end of the day, they're human beings like you and I. They want their paycheck to be higher and not lower, and they perform to the metrics and the criteria of their profession, and the criteria and metrics of their profession is not, is this true, is this good, is this serving, the public interest, is this educational? Their metric and standard is like, is this getting attention or not? And so they are essentially whores to that very easily gamed metric.
Well, we've been talking with Ryan Holiday about the book The Brasscheck, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. Everybody knows the author, Upton Sinclair. Very few people know this book. It was a super bestseller in its time, and it's somehow fallen through the cracks. And I want to encourage people that are interested in the media today to get The Brasscheck and read it and see that what Ryan's saying is true. Upton Sinclair is describing an environment very similar, maybe different in detail, but similar in spirit, unfortunately, to the media environment we have today. And a good companion book for that would be Ryan's first book, Trust Me, I'm Lying, Confessions of a Media Manipulator, talking about how this works in the internet environment. And Ryan has another book, by the way, I strongly recommend. His latest is called Stillness is the Key, and you'll be able to get that after October 1st. So thank you, Ryan, for being with us and talking about this important American classic.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I agree. I think it's a book everyone should read. I think they should teach it in schools. I think it's more important than The Jungle. And it's wonderful to talk to you about it.